pleasure to introduce Dr. Simon Gadbois. He's an ethologist and behavioural neuroscientist from Dalhousie University in Canada. He completed his PhD research at the Canadian Centre for Wolf Research in Nova Scotia, where he studied social behaviour in wolves and its hormonal correlates. His research team currently focuses on wild canid and applied olfactory processing, such as tracking dogs used to monitor species at risk and other wildlife. His work has been featured in numerous documentaries, and he is a frequent guest speaker on canines. Please join us in welcoming Dr. Simon Gadbois, speaking about it's not what you like, but what you want that counts.
Hello again. Okay, so the talk today is a little bit different. Today and tomorrow, actually, we going back to dogs, although today's talk is quite theoretical in some ways because it's about trying to explain how and why dogs learn and why you may actually find some breed differences, if not individual differences as well, between dogs. So I'll give some background on this as we go. One thing I want to say here is, it's a very general comment, is that most people from the public, for very good practical reasons, you know scientists that publish books. Those are the scientists you know. But if you imagine a window of what the number of scientists out there doing canid or canine research, there's hundreds of them. That means that the window that you know is about this wide, when actually it's probably from this side of the room to the other side of the room in terms of how many scientists are out there. And most scientists don't write books simply, well, for a number of reasons, or they do maybe later in their career when they retire, things like this. And obviously, I'm not saying that there's something abnormal there. You have to understand how science works, and it's usually through peer-reviewed publications, etc. So that's what it counts for building a career typically. So one of the things I'll do today is introduce you to another scientist that you probably don't know, Kent Berridge, that has a very interesting theory of how the brain works, but in a way, it's a theory that was developed in parallel from another scientist that you know, very likely, some of you at least I know do know him, Panksepp, that was mentioned already a number of times, and there are a number of people out there that tell you a lot about him, and he's now on the dog conference circuit as well. But the Berridge theory is actually has some characteristics that makes it quite interesting, in my opinion. So you saw this yesterday, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit again here. And it's basically the idea that I try to integrate these three domains of research in what I do with canids, including dogs. So some behavioral biology, some neuroscience, and some experimental psychology. But based on what I said yesterday, I want to add something which is on the left here. And it's a comment that goes mostly towards experimental psychology, but a little bit towards neuroscience as well, especially if we describe here cognitive neuroscience, or the neuroscience that overlaps massively with psychology. There's also social and behavioral neuroscience that's part of this. So in the history of psychology, of experimental psychology, behaviorism was always last century, a strong force. But actually, interestingly, that changed sometime in the 60s, where there was the cognitive revolution that started. And what I find really interesting in the dog world, among dog trainers, is that actually it seems that anything that came after that, which is the cognitive revolution of the 60s and the 70s, seemed to be not necessarily ignored, but kind of floating somewhere out there, and people don't seem to know what to do with this cognitive stuff. How does it apply to us? And the way I understand it is that as dog trainers, you tend to be very, very pragmatic people, very practical. If I can use it, I'll use it. It's a tool. But otherwise, if it's just concept, talking about this and that, it's like, you have to ground this for me. And I think maybe scientists, we've not been very good at explaining why it may be relevant to know about some of these things. So I will actually try to connect it to some of the stuff that you do. Hopefully it will work. And adding the neuroscience perspective to this as well. And actually, interestingly, obviously, the neuroscience part of this started, I would say, in the late 80s, early 90s. There was this cognitive revolution, and I kind of mentioned yesterday that it became a little bit too much sometimes in in the popularization of science, where there's that kind of neuroscientism where, neuroscience explains everything, right? People wonder about something, oh, it's because dopamine. Okay, fine, we're done then. All right, see you. Right? But the thing is, it really doesn't say much if you don't understand the neuroscience, the actual mechanisms, and most neuroscientists are still struggling with a lot of those concepts. And then there's another revolution brewing. And I see it pop out here and there. And it's the neo or post-cognitivism. In fact, some of it has been going on for a while. And it has all kinds of flavors and colors attached to it. And it's in part questioning a lot of things about cognitive science, for one. What has it given us? And sometimes bringing back a little bit of behaviorism into thinking about behavior. And trying to integrate it better with neuroscience as well, under what we call often neurocognition, for instance. So there's a lot of very interesting things going on that you may not be aware of, and I'll try to address some of those today. So the learning goals were saying, or suggesting that we would talk a little bit about the behavioral neuroscience of motivation today. And you'll say, well, wait a minute, this is the day about personality and that kind of stuff. Well, okay, but that's exactly in that context that I will try to describe it, how motivation actually matters. Motivation is one of those things, as Ray mentioned today actually, that is so fundamental to the study of actually all those three circles that you saw in the Venn diagram. In behavioral biology, certainly ethology within that group, absolutely experimental psychology, including behaviorism. They were always very interested in motivation. And obviously neuroscience. The neuroscience of motivation right now is one of the big tickets in science if you're interested in behavioral or cognitive neuroscience. So we'll talk a little bit about those different types of systems and also wrap this up with the direct relevance to personality theory and working dogs. So a number of years ago at the Canadian Science Forum in Vienna, I was a guest speaker, and I pissed off a number of people because I was basically saying, I was asked to talk about neuroscience and comment about it, the canine neuroscience. So I was one of the first speakers, and I said basically, well, there's not much of it, which was actually totally true at the time. And part of the reason is because most of neuroscience tends to be quite invasive. And obviously, we don't want to be invasive with animals that we like, with pets, our dogs, etc. What I didn't realize is that that year, there were a lot of people after me that were talking about quite a bit of neuroscience with dogs. So I didn't make many friends there. But anyway, but here's the issue. So you're saying, well, wait a minute, they did neuroscience with dogs, so that was invasive? Okay. So there's an interesting little conversation to have with those concepts. We have to distinguish between invasive, in my opinion, and obtrusive. So are we doing invasive neuroscience with dogs? As far as I know, no, at least not in North America, probably not in Europe either. And if we define it as, for instance, implanting electrodes in the brain of dogs, as far as I know, it's not going on in Europe and North America. Okay. Although it's going on with cats and many other animals, rats and mice and etc. But if you define it as, let's say, something that is a little bit more in the way, inconvenient, stressful, then yes, and obtrusiveness would go, in my opinion, in that category. So, for instance, neuroimaging. It's very trendy now to do neuroimaging. Some of you know some people that do this. Mick Closey, that I respect highly, by the way, is a good friend of mine. Also Burns, more recently, or just last year, actually. So that is going on. And I'll tell you a little story, and it's about me. It's not about criticizing the other research. It's about my stance on this. Many years ago, a friend of mine in Halifax, that was the director of the Neuroimaging Center, said, you know what, Simon, we have a fMRI that actually can work with animals. If you wanted to get your dogs to come, I'll make you a special price, $200 an hour. And you can do some research there. And we say, wow, okay, that's a great opportunity. This is about 7-8 years ago. But then I thought, wait a minute, at $200 an hour, I better make sure that the dog can actually do this. And you don't want to use anesthetic with dogs in neuroimaging simply for what I would call, although it's strange, but kind of ecological validity. What is a brain under anesthetic? Well, it's not a normal brain, okay, in many ways. So we wanted the dogs to be completely conscious, let's say, while the stuff was going on. And it was mostly based on my interest in olfaction, something we'll discuss mostly tomorrow. So we basically built in the lab a mock fMRI, which actually ended up just being a big tube with a mock noise of the fMRI. And then we tried to get the dogs to go in there and lie down immobile. And okay, this is where it's like fun. Putting a dog in a small constrained area, enclosed area, with some noise that you're not familiar with, and asking them not to move is not easy. But all of you here, or most of you anyway, are dog trainers. You say, well, you can do this, clicker training, blah, blah, blah. Yes, I agree. But at what price? And this is where the obtrusiveness part comes in. And I think, personally, I have to say, though, that I was a little bit influenced by the fact that one of my dogs was actually part of that project. And after, I forget if it was a week or 3 weeks, it felt like it lasted forever. I said, you know what, I can't stand this. Seeing the distress, a lot of those dogs that were really trying to please us, but were clearly very uncomfortable, I said, you know what, it's not worth it. So I never actually got into the neuroimaging work. I can't say it's not for me. And I'm very happy that others are doing it because there is extremely valuable data to gain from this. But personally, it's not something I will do. So obtrusiveness is something to keep in mind when we do neuroscience. And then you'll say, well, then what kind of neuroscience can you do with dogs? Well, look, the neuroscience I used to do with wolves was actually behavioral endocrinology, which was quite non-invasive because in a way with hormones, we're quite lucky because we can actually get from urine, from feces, even from saliva and hair or fur, metabolites of some very important hormones that regulate social behavior or sexual behavior. For instance, testosterone, estrogens, cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So our work was fantastic because we never had to touch those wolves. We would just watch them pee or defecate somewhere and take notes exactly where that was happening and wait for them to leave. And after they were gone, we would go out there with a little Ziploc bags and a little spoon and collect the yellow snow, right? And then bring it to the lab later, process it. And with feces, it's even easier because you can actually get DNA, so you don't actually have to be there and track them constantly to know who's pooing where, because that gets tedious too. So that's great. Now, we'll talk about neurotransmitters today, but there's another challenge with neurotransmitters. The process that I just described, you can't do this with neurotransmitters. You're not peeing out neurotransmitters or their metabolites either. With neurotransmitters, you actually have to get into, with live animals, the cerebrospinal fluid. You need access to it, which is usually done by a spinal tap. You know where this is going. This now is becoming quite invasive. So unless those dogs are typically going through a medical procedure that requires already to go and play in those areas, you don't typically want to do this. Or you wait for the dogs to die, then collect their brains, et cetera, and get some of that information that way. So that causes some problems. To understand the neuropharmacology, the neurochemicals, or the neurochemistry, I should say, in dogs requires more invasive work typically. But one thing that you can do is look at some of the current models that we have with rodents, doesn't matter if it's rat, mice, or whatever, and you assume a number of things, such as, for instance, that actually the brain of mammals is quite similar from species to species. It's a reasonable assumption. We do this in science all the time. This is why a lot of biomedical testing is done on rats and mice, obviously. So we trust, in a way, that the brain of a rat and the brain of a human or brain of a dog are not that different. Now, we know that sometimes that can actually create some problems. But it depends also which part of the brain you're interested in. So one of the arguments that Panksepp makes, for instance, to actually study animals and make some fairly solid generalization between species, is that he's actually very interested in the limbic system. And the system I'm interested in is actually part of the limbic system, which is the olfactory system. And what's interesting in invertebrates is that it's an extremely well-conserved system from fish right up to mammals, birds being kind of a weird exception here. And Ray this morning was actually mentioning, for instance, with the vomeronasal organ that we'll mention briefly tomorrow, that it's also there in reptiles. In fact, it's there in fish. You even see, actually mostly in amphibians. You see it in amphibians, reptiles, not birds really. And in mammals, it's most mammals. Humans actually, interestingly, with neuroimaging, we can actually see the VNO. The only thing is it's actually not connected to the rest of the olfactory system. So basically it's the vestigial kind of structure, okay? And in fact, the only mammals that don't have it are basically cetaceans, so whales and dolphins. So if you're interested in the limbic system, you can do pretty safe generalizations from rats to dogs to humans, or back and forth like this. But that's not always the case, obviously. Okay. So now I want to put this in context of working dogs. This is one of my interests because I don't work with your average pooch most of the time, in fact never in the last 8 years. We work with exceptional dogs, or potentially exceptional ones, because we do a lot of work in scent detection in applied settings. So we have a really stringent selection process where we try to find the best potential sniffers. And there's a number of questions that have occurred over the years, such as how do we do this well, and how are we finding the best working dogs, which is quite relevant to some of the things already discussed today. And what's interesting here is that I work a lot with dog trainers, like a lot of you guys. And many of them come to me and say, Simon, I would love to actually get involved in this. And then we work in collaboration, and it's great. But unfortunately, there's a few dog trainers that decide out of the blue, without much training in many cases, that they'll do that too. And I'll get into scent training. And then they will get hired by this organization and this government agency, and we'll show them how it's done, etc. The problem with this is that there's a lot of dog trainers that have literally ruined the reputation of sniffer dogs by doing this, because they don't have sufficient background in the subtleties of this kind of research. And this is also part of what I want to convey to you today, is that actually scent work is really a specialized form of dog training. It sounds simple, and it's not. And I'm still learning, and we're still making a lot of mistakes every year, okay? That we slowly try to fix, or as fast as possible in many cases. So the first thing that you need to know if you get into the sensory work, especially olfactory work, is some elements of psychophysics. That is a part of experimental psychology that is all about sensory processes and how you measure them. And the problem with olfaction, especially for humans, is that we're dealing with a stimulus that is not tangible, that we don't see, and we don't understand it. Humans were really stupid when it comes to odors. We have no idea how it works, and yet dogs have, this is their main sensory modality. They have a real amazing understanding of their olfactory world. It's like vision. Our vision for them, okay? So the other thing that you need to know is some behavioral processes. In fact, I will discuss some of them, especially what I call olfactomotor processes. If you're interested in this, by the way, Catherine, Reeve, and myself, we have, I'm a PhD student that is here, we have a chapter in the book edited by Alexander Horowitz on the question of olfaction that discusses a lot of those issues. Then you need to know about cognitive processes and actually things like attention, working memory, those, especially working memory that I will discuss tomorrow, is a kind of a cognitive issue. Motivational factors that I will get into today, and some affective processes as well, like making it fun. Because the thing is, all of our working dogs are working only if they're having fun. The day they start not having fun, they don't work for us anymore. Okay, there's no point. It becomes a form of abuse in a ways. But one of the problems that we have sometimes is that they start well, and then we get a loss of that working drive. And this is more common than you think. People don't like to admit it, but you talk to people that do specialized dog training in the military, with police forces. I consulted for the GICHD a number of years ago, the Geneva International Convention on Humanitarian Demining. They had a great dog program there. And sometimes these things happen. And the problem is you invested so much time and money in some training those dogs, and one day they stop working. And if you think about assistance dogs or biomedical detection dogs, for cancer dogs, for instance, it's a real issue because you don't know when they'll decide that, I'm not doing this anymore. And you need to find ways to detect actually that time where they decide not to work. And we don't really know if it's a cognitive issue in the sense that they want to do it, but they can't. Or if it's a motivational one, they can, but they don't want to do it anymore. And it could be also that it's just not fun anymore. So this is where you want to be able to keep that hedonic value, that pleasure value in the work. So that's why, for instance, in my lab, we use play quite a bit. Not necessarily as a primary reinforcer, although in some cases we do. And I'll explain why later this can be tricky. But we try to associate all the work with play. Okay, so this is another Venn diagram. There you go, you kind of get the point, I like them. That represent actually some of the big issues about trying to understand working dogs. So the cognitive stuff, the motivational stuff, the affective stuff, and some of the motor issues I will discuss a little bit later. Okay, so from the cognitive perspective, one of the interesting issues actually is the question of attention. And anybody that actually works with working dogs will tell you this is a big one. In fact, Helton has published this book called Canine Ergonomics, which is all about working dogs, and it's really his specialty actually. How do you keep attention in dogs that do work that requires attention, and sometimes for a long period of time? And there's different types of attention. There's selective attention, which is basically channel selection, making sure that they're in the right sensory modality and really focus on the right type of stimulus. There's divided attention, which is something that you actually try to minimize with most working dogs. You don't want them to be all over the place. You want them to really focus on the right thing. There's focused attention, which I think, well, at least we believe is trainable, especially with search dogs, so when you do tracking and trailing. And then there's stuff we're not really interested in with dogs, like for instance, unfocused attention. That's kind of weird left field kind of stuff. So we don't go there with that. I'm not saying dogs can't meditate, or maybe they, who knows. No, let's not get into that one. And then there's sustained attention, which actually connects to some more physiological aspects of how the brain works, concept of vigilance and arousal that we find quite a bit in neuroscience, actually. So some of the issues are, how do you know if attention is sustained? How do you know when the dog is stopping to pay attention? Is he working? Is he not working? But sometimes they sniff, and they seem to be doing their thing, but really they're not. And maybe they're just looking for something else. This is kind of is a real problem, and some scientists call it actually the issue of vigilance decrement, which actually exists in humans as well, especially when you have a repetitive job, when actually not much is happening. And this is where it's the most dangerous for those dogs to actually get completely disengaged. And it's also called a rare event problem. Again, when nothing is happening, dogs have a problem trying to keep focused. But you don't have to think about dogs here. You don't have to go that far. It's a real issue in some areas of human work as well, in terms of ergonomics. Missile interceptions. If your job is to look at a radar all day long, waiting for a potential missile to attack your country, and it's a country that's not at war, this is freaking boring. How do you keep those people from not falling asleep and keeping vigilant and so they can actually prevent problems? And my real favorite is the weapons and luggages, because that affects all of you, especially if you came here by plane. Did you know that actually there's people now that do research on this, and actually Jeremy Wolf here in the US is one of them. And his job was to actually come up with a way to keep the people that actually screen your luggages when you go through security at the airport, to keep working well. And maybe you didn't realize this, but they're actually playing a video game. And what I mean by this is that to keep their attention, the system, the computer system they use, at least in some airports in the US and Canada, actually will implant dummy weapons. And the game, it's almost like a video game, like I said, is for them to say, yep, there's something here, or obviously not give a response. But then what happens is the system will say, okay, good job, yep, that was indeed something, but don't worry, it's not a real weapon, okay? And if they detect a real one and the system says, whoa, where's that coming from? Yeah, you're right, that may be a weapon. You have to go look into those luggages right away, okay? And the only thing here is to just try to keep those people awake. So they're actually working more than you think, and they're constantly quizzed, all right? So in the field work that we do with conservation canines that look for species at risk, we have this problem sometimes where, you know, you lose track of time. It's been already 2 or 3 hours in the field. You haven't found what you're looking for, and then you start realizing that your dogs, I don't think they're, you know, tuned in anymore. So this is where you actually have to plant samples that they will actually find, and then you go like, yay, you found it, you know, and give a big party, and then they get all proud and stuff, and then the motivation comes back, and they continue working as if they were all, you know, starting the day from scratch, basically. Okay, there's a few things I need to mention here. For instance, in a way, motivation, if you can actually, in a way, manipulate or control the motivational status of your animal, will actually turn around the cognitive or that lack of attention that you have. So for instance, with classical conditioning and learning, you can actually work with what we call conditioned motivations by working with, for instance, conditioned reinforcers. By the way, I'll talk about the clicker in a minute, but that's kind of where it's going. And also learning, in terms of instrumental conditioning, what most of you work with, therefore will be facilitated. And you can use that as well, or some principles of it, to keep the attention of the dogs as well. So in some ways, motivation can be learned, absolutely, and learning is fueled by motivation. So those two things work very much together. Really the key word here for the neuroscience I'm going to cover is the word anticipation. It's to make the animals anticipate things. You want them to anticipate stuff. So the theory I want to talk about today is actually from Ken Berridge. Berridge actually was a student of John Fentress, a postdoc student actually in the 80s. I just missed him by a few years, and actually did not really work with the wolves. He actually worked with John on his rodent model, was very much interested in the basal ganglia, and it's basically that part of the brain that is very much into that neurotransmitter that we call dopamine. And dopamine is very important in the motor system, but also in the motivational system of the brain, and that's where I'm going to go right now. So the first system that he actually identified is the liking system, okay? So remember that one, it's an important liking system. The liking system basically is all the pleasurable stuff, and Ray mentioned some of these things. And it's very much connected to limbic functions. The amygdala, for instance, the hippocampus, the septum, the fornix, etc. There's a bunch of structures within that system, including the olfactory bulb. Then there's the wanting system. And then Kent get to talk about incentive salience. I won't get into too many details here, but I think you're going to connect the dots a little bit later about this. This is actually quite equivalent to what Panksepp calls the seeking system, okay? Which again is connected to dopamine. Now I just want to say a thing. I know that some of you are very familiar with the Panksepp taxonomy. And as you know, Panksepp actually is really focused on what we call affective or social neuroscience. A lot of the systems that he identified are really around emotions and the social life of animals. So that's why he talks about the fear system, the panic system, the rage system, the lust system, the play system. In fact, in the preface of his 1998 book, he even talks about the possibility of a dominant system within the brain. We won't go there. And then the seeking system, and in a way, in a strange way actually, the seeking system within his taxonomy is probably the only one that doesn't necessarily have a very strong kind of social connection in its original definition. And that's why other scientists, like Berridge, for instance, have taken this from a different perspective, which is how the brain learns, basically. And that's the third system from the Berridge conceptualization, where he describes how the brain learns, essentially. But it's highly dependent on the liking and the wanting system. Okay, so here's the thing. In ethology, for a long time, we've always distinguished between two categories of behavior: appetitive behaviors, connected to motivational systems very much, and consummatory behaviors. This is when you actually enjoy, let's say, the gazelle that you just killed, if you're a lion. Okay. In a way, appetitive behaviors are connected to the seeking system that Panksepp talks about. And then, traditionally, in neuroscience, the reward system is the one that actually kind of, again, enjoy the food, the reward, or the reinforcer. All right. Berridge would say the seeking system, the appetitive behavior stuff, is basically what he calls the wanting system, and the liking system, again, has to do with the emotions. As you will see, different parts of the brain involved in those two systems. And if you look at appetitive systems towards the bottom, it's all about exploratory behavior. This is when the animal is basically engaged in trying to find the nugget or the gazelle or the whatever makes that animal feel good, but has not had access to it yet. It's anticipating it. And that lights up the brain like a Christmas tree. And that's the key, is to tap into that system. And contrary to what most people think, not the other one. Because the other one, you'll say, well, wait a minute, it's the reward system. Yeah, but that's actually, interestingly, not the one that gets the animal to do things. Okay? And I know it sounds a little bit strange, but there's an interesting logic behind this. So first of all, and I will explain this in a minute, but if you look at the seeking system, wanting system, dopamine, as I said, is the main neurotransmitter here. That's the one that kicks in. But notice that with the emotional part, the other system, it's endorphins. So here, a little neuropharmacology. Dopamine is your natural cocaine. Cocaine is an agonist, meaning that it increases level of dopamine. It's a stimulant. Okay? Endorphins are very much morphine. It's your internal morphine. Very, very different effect on the system and behavior. One excites you, the other one inhibits you. So the idea is that if you tap too much into the liking system, you get an animal now that is not anymore engaged. It's enjoying the gazelle or the nugget or whatever, but not really looking into producing another behavior. So in other words, the whole idea in behavioral neuroscience is you want to keep them on the left side, okay, with the appetitive, seeking, wanting. You want to tap into the dopaminergic system and not as much the other one. But the thing is, those two work together, okay? They're not independent. Okay. So dopamine, I'll just say a little bit more about dopamine. Dopamine is involved in all kinds of things. I will talk a little bit about sensation seeking. I forget what Sam actually told us earlier. He uses a different term, but some people call it thrill seeking, sensation seeking. There's a number of terms to describe this, and I will mention a few things about this. The cognitive system, attention requires dopamine actually, with other neurotransmitters as well, by the way. Ray was talking about norepinephrine, yeah, that's totally part of it as well. At the motivation level, the value of the reward is determined by that system. Not the reward itself, but its value, and that's the concept of incentive salience. And at the behavioral level, dopamine is essential. If you think about a lot of movement disorders, like Parkinson's disease, Huntington, etc., it actually involves parts of the brain that produce or respond to dopamine, okay? And obviously, as you will see tomorrow, I'm very much interested in the olfactory system and sniffing in dogs. And what's interesting here is that there's a little kind of subdivision of this within the olfactory system. Remember, during the panel yesterday, I mentioned something about implicit versus explicit processes in cognitive neuroscience and psychology. And that's kind of a hint here. When you just walk around and process smell, that's quite implicit. We call that smelling. You don't realize that you smell things, but you don't really pay attention to them, right? You couldn't. I mean, you would get overwhelmed. And imagine dogs even more, right? But explicit simply means in this case that the animal is consciously engaging in the behavior. Like, what's this? Okay? And that behavior is what we call olfactomotor. And we think this is the one that actually, when you see this in a dog, you know they're engaged. You know they're working the olfactory system, and I'll talk more about that tomorrow. Okay? Panksepp actually talks about exploratory sniffing, and in some of his papers he actually says that sniffing may actually be one of the best behavioral system to actually study this seeking system. Okay, so I'm going to actually go really fast on this. This is actually kind of a little bit boring and maybe more technical that you would like to to know, but it's just to make the point that dopamine is very much everywhere in the olfactory system. This is more related to what I will be talking tomorrow, but at many, many different levels. At the cortical level, so the surface of the brain, very much involved in cognitive processing, for instance, but also the subcortical level, including, by the way, in the limbic system. So I'm not saying that it's only endorphins in the limbic system. Dopamine is there as well. But mostly the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia is that part of the brain that is just all about dopamine. Okay, that's where addictions. And I say basal ganglia, by the way, for people that know the brain. It's also related areas like the substantia nigra, for instance, and a few others, the VTA, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the olfactory system, you find a lot of dopaminergic receptors. So in other words, you need dopamine to get the olfactory system to work well. In fact, there's some evidence with rats that giving amphetamines in rats, which is a stimulant like cocaine, will actually increase their sense of smell. So there's indication that you can probably do this with maybe less dangerous drugs, like for instance, caffeine or other stimulants, although it's not the best to tap into the dopaminergic system, but others are being investigated right now. Okay, so let's go back to this idea that it's not the reward that matters, but the anticipation of the reward, because that's really the intriguing part of this model. It's what Panksepp has been telling you, some of you, for a number of years now, but it's also part of that theory from Berridge. So actually, the whole idea here is this idea that it's your sensitivity to predict the reward that is going to be important. And in fact, what's amazing about this, it justifies or explains why the clicker is so powerful. Because the clicker as a secondary reinforcer is basically click. And what that means is there is, or there could be, a reward following this. But that reward hasn't happened yet. And that's, again, it's the key. By the way, clicker training should not be about constantly pairing click, food, click, food, click, food. That's actually part of the first 15 minutes that you will do the clicker training. And after that, you stop giving the food. You just do click. And the dog should respond to this as the reward. It's a conditioning reinforcer. That's the whole idea, right? Because you tap into that sequence system. It's saying, could be a reward. Okay? And in fact, if you give the reward, it actually interferes with the behavior. It makes them behave less, with less intensity as well. All right. I'll get back to that in a minute. All right. So in a way, what's interesting here is that actually, if you look at some of the invasive, no, actually not so invasive in this case, but research that Panksepp reports with cats, it was very interesting here to explore this meaning of this idea of reward. It's all about the onset and offset of those two systems. When you get that system to fire up and to shut down, because you need to get one up, down, okay, it works like this. So basically, here's the experiment. You have a cat, and you have two objects. And actually, they used brain stimulation as a reward in very specific parts of the brain that are sensitive to reward, so rewarding for the cat. And the procedure is this, is that you give a reward when the cat touches object 1. And then you get no reward when the cat is touching object 2. And then you present in alternance those two objects, okay? Or simultaneously in some cases, and the cat goes from one to the other. Now, after you've done this, you're going to try to look how much time the cat spends with both objects. Which object do you think the cats actually prefer? Will spend more time with? Yeah, with object 2. Not the one that delivered the reward, but the one that predicted it. Okay? So in other words, somehow they get this idea that it's, okay, this is going to happen, and this is the key to get me feel better or feel good. So again, get those two systems to work together. There's a very interesting kind of dialectics going between the two. So that's the thing, is that for the testing, you don't give rewards anymore, and they spend more time with object number 2, which again was not associated directly with a reward. So in a way, again, this idea, it's the anticipation of the reward that counts, not the reward itself. So you can think of simple examples with dogs, for instance. If you really want your dog really, really excited, is to grab the leash, right? And all these things that announce, oh, we're going for a walk, right? And then you're on the walk, and I'm not saying they're not excited, but nothing compared to actually when they were saying, oh, it's going to be the walk now. And that is because you're tapping into that seeking system, all right? So in a way, it's all about anticipation, which, by the way, also suggests something else, as I said earlier, interesting, is that this explains why the clicker works. So the clicker training means simply that you work with what we call secondary or condition reinforcers. Okay, so the clicker becomes, the thing that says you're going to get, or you could get, a reward. But there's another way to do this, is to use schedules of reinforcement. Okay, so in other words, if you want to have a dog that will produce behaviors consistently, and also will be very resistant to extinction, what you want to do is make sure that you're not rewarding every time they do it correctly. And you'll say, well, that's cruel. Well, no, actually, it's not. In fact, there's a lot of problems with reinforcing every time that you get the right response. Is extinction, but also you would see a huge difference with a dog that is not reinforced every time. They will work a lot harder for the reward if you don't reward them every time, okay? So this is why the behaviorists, Skinner and others, came up with this idea of schedules of reinforcement. On these 4 types, basically. And by the way, people that actually program slot machines really understand the magic of it, okay? So the first 2 that we call fixed ratios or fixed intervals, so here that defines either an interval of time before you actually deliver the reinforcer, or how many trials, let's say, before you actually say, okay, fine, you deserve this now, okay? Fixed means fixed, and that's the problem, is it becomes extremely predictable. After a while, for instance, the rats will just realize that they just don't have to work too hard, and they just wait for the time lapse, and then they start working. So for instance, if you're on a fixed interval, you'll often see the rats in the Skinner box they say that it won't happen for the next 10 seconds or 15 seconds, whatever they do. So they just stand there like, yeah. It's going to be soon, okay? They press the lever like crazy at the last minute, and why would they work before if, So there you go. So the trick here is to actually use variable ratios and intervals, because now they don't know. When is this reward going to be delivered? I don't know, sometimes it's early, sometimes it's late, so they keep, and they just wait for it, and that's it. Now you're tapping into the seeking system big time. They are completely anticipating what is going to happen next, all right? And that's how animals actually learn. Now, this is actually a good day in our lab. It's a Border Collie day. Okay. Give me a minute. I know, they're great. We love them. We still work with them, by the way. I mean, these guys actually work great. The Shiloh, we don't know yet, actually, because she's quite young, actually, in that picture. But this is just fantastic. Now, I have to explain a few things here, by the way. It's about Border Collies. So there's jokes at Dalhousie University that we're the Border Collie lab. And it's in part because of this dopamine hypothesis that we've put forward, actually, explained in the Horowitz book, as you will see in a minute, and actually Ray mentioned that this morning, there's evidence that they just have a different neurochemical profile compared to other breeds, and especially when you look at dopamine, interestingly. And the problem with Border Collies, obviously, is, they're neurotic, okay? ADHD, OCD, the whole thing. When I got my first Border Collie, I remember it didn't take 48 hours that I thought, oh God, what have I done? The first morning that I got that dog, at 5:30 in the morning, just as light comes in the bedroom, I hear, I open my eyes, I look, oh my, she's right there looking at me in the eyes, picks that ball, drops it, picks the ball, drops it, and looks at me kind of, let's go outside, let's go play ball. Then right away I knew my wife was in trouble. I'm not a morning person because that meant that we were going to have to wake up early a lot, or she would have to do it. And the thing is, I really got addicted actually to Border Collies. I kept saying they're crazy dogs, but I love them. They're so neurotic, it's fascinating. And then my wife would look at me and say, if you were a dog or a dog breed, and then I would, no, don't say it. Don't say it. And then she threw the ball and I just got off. But it's true, I'm a little bit Border Collie. Not the worst, but and I'm settling down with age as well, 47, I'm starting to get a little bit calmer. No, not really. So I'll discuss a little bit those breed predispositions. And by the way, this is interesting because sometimes we have some of those animal activist groups that, and by the way, I should say this, and probably Catherine will say this tomorrow in her talk as well. All the dogs we use at Dalhousie are pets. So we recruit them from the community, and they visit the lab once, twice, 3, 4 times a week, depending on the projects and the dog and their motivation and everything. And the owners bring them in the morning and pick them up later in the day. So we post everywhere in the city, we need your dog. It's interesting because we actually never ask for Border Collies, but it just happens that a lot of them are volunteered by their owners. So at first we went like, okay, we'll go with this. But what's interesting is that, remember, we're working with working dogs, and we want dogs that have a really good working ethics. By the way, don't ask me what that means. I have no idea, but we just use that term because it sounds great, and we kind of know what it means. And we kind of got to really appreciate working with them because they want to work, and they want to work all the time. The thing with Border Collies, though, is that energy, you really have to focus it, as you know. And when you manage to do this, and it doesn't always work, then we're doing great. And this is why our retention with Border Collies is about 75%. With almost all other breeds that we've had so far, it's much lower than that, meaning that many, many of them don't make it, okay? So anyway, again, these guys were actually quite good, but they, maybe more the exception than anything else. So Ray this morning talked a little bit about Aaronson Shoemaker in 1992 published a paper that's kind of forgotten. In fact, the only 2 persons that I know that actually keep mentioning it are actually Ray and me. And Aaronson Shoemaker did something quite interesting, is that they actually look at the neurotransmitter profiles of a number of breeds. And interestingly, this is where they actually identified this kind of Border Collie kind of thing, of pattern. And I'm not saying they're OCD or ADHD, by the way. I really say OCD-like, ADHD-like tendencies. And let's not pathologize things too much here, but I think most of you kind of know what I'm saying, all right? And it's obviously not all of them, but you do find some of this, and sometimes in extreme ways in some of those dogs. By the way, I just realized I started saying it and then I branched out. I was saying that animal activist groups get on our case sometimes because they say dogs shouldn't work. They shouldn't be working. They should be pets. And they say that, having working dogs is cruel. What I say to those people is what's cruel, especially with Border Collies and some of those very active breeds, is to expect that they can stay at home on the sofa all day long waiting for you to come back from work. That is cruelty, okay? Otherwise, I do believe that if they want to work, okay, it's better for them. And in fact, you should see, unfortunately, I don't have those videos here, I just thought of it, but when their owners will say when they walk them to the university in the morning, they're like this, and they run full spin to the door of the lab, and they literally line up. We have pictures of this, actually. They line up at the experimental room door, waiting for their turn, just to go in there and kind of do some work. So there's a few other breeds that actually have this profile in some ways. Belgian Malinois, certainly Jack Russells, Parsons, other neurotic breeds. And interestingly, you can, as I said, connect this to sensation-seeking behavior. Again, this kind of wanting kind of thing. And this is quite interesting, actually, because Ray yesterday mentioned something about, maybe dogs sometimes fight because it's fun. And actually, I thought immediately about this, which I think is an interesting idea, that sometimes fighting may not be as much fun as there's a bit of a, well, I guess it has to be in some ways, but there's a little bit of this kind of like, let's create trouble a little bit, make this a little bit exciting. And we all know people that do this. They can't be couch potatoes and sit down to watch a TV show because they'll click, click, click on it, and they're the kind of people that on the weekend will, probably want to do, I don't know, skydiving or bungee jumping, that kind of stuff, which we all know is completely stupid. It's, I personally think it's much better just to do free climbing. At least you go up, not down. But I used to do free climbing when I was younger and stupid. All right, oops. So one of the problems that we have, like I said, to go back to motivation, is that we experience this kind of field effect. We called it field effect. And it's this idea that actually we have dogs that will work super well in the field, but then when we bring them back into the lab to actually do simply maintenance training or getting retrained on a new scent, they won't work anymore. They don't want anything to do with the lab. So one of the things that we've been working on for years now is to try to resuscitate, in a way, that motivation, and basically trying to bring the outdoors or the field in the lab. And we've experienced with a number of things like rooting, which actually Clive Wynne talks about in one of his papers, foraging, really getting the dog to get into that full kind of motor activation, including the olfactomotor stuff. Okay, so we actually bury the samples, for instance, that they have to detect or discriminate in the substrate. You'll say, well, that's stupid. You make it a lot harder for them. Well, that's the whole point, is to get them motivated, to get them going, to engage that olfactomotor system. That's what you need to do. And their performance is potentially better, despite the fact that you actually add a lot of noise. And by noise in psychophysics, we mean interference. But we think they're actually doing better, and we're trying to gather this data right now to demonstrate that indeed, if you make it harder for them, if you challenge them, they do better than if it's boring. Okay, another sterilized glass jar or stainless steel jar. Oh my God, this is so boring. And then they don't want to do it anymore. So that's why they do so well outdoors. When they are massively challenged, they come back to the lab and, I don't want anything to do with this. So, whoops. So again, we have a tendency to believe that those dopamine breeds are what's actually usually working for us. Because again, it taps into that seeking system. It seems that they have a better sustained attention, especially when you do get their attention with the ball or whatever, play, for instance. There's this idea that we can use plants to make sure that they keep the interest, even if, in the field sometimes things are boring, because especially in what we do, we're looking for species at risk. They're endangered. By definition, they're rare. So they can spend quite a while before they find actually what we want. So we work with ribbon snakes and wood turtles that have an endangered status actually in Nova Scotia. We mentioned already that clicker may actually be a key in all of this, and obviously the schedule's reinforcement. There's another thing here that may actually be important, is play. Okay, so now you have to be very careful. I told you that we want our dogs to be motivated and to have fun. Fun is actually part of this liking system, and that's the reward, and its endorphins are produced. But also, if they anticipate that play, right? And why not take advantage of this? Some of you know Ken Ramirez. Ken actually would make the argument you have to be very careful when you want to reinforce with play. And I totally agree. Because the thing is, play can really overshadow all of this. They get really into it, and it's like, I want to play, I want to play, I want to play. But the problem is, if you keep doing this, they won't produce the behaviors that you want anymore. So you actually have to get them to snap out of it, say, okay, now we're done. Okay? And that takes time. Reinforcer with play, too, is not quick. It's not like doing click. It's more like, okay, we get the ball, get them excited, and then, okay, we stop. The sessions when we use play are significantly longer than when we just use the clicker. But the trick is this, is to actually give them a little bit of discipline here. And by this, I simply mean say, okay, we play, just one throw of the ball, you bring it back, okay, thank you. Now we go back. And they look at you like, no, more. And then it's like, well, yeah, sure, we'll do more. Let's go back to work for a minute, and then we'll do more, all right? And so play can actually work if you use it well. If you don't overuse it, it will be your best friend. Plus, the animal is having fun, and that's the whole point, right? Hopefully. So yes, play can be used as a reinforcer, but again, the whole trick here is to know how to play with those two systems, back and forth and back and forth. And you have to be careful because actually, I told you that actually the seeking system is about dopamine. It's about increasing dopamine levels. It's very sensitive to dopamine. So dopamine agonists, like cocaine, for instance, or amphetamines, or the anticipation of a reward, will actually increase the seeking behaviors, will increase olfaction, which is great for us that do a lot of scent work, but will decrease play. So you see, you got to get them on, then off, then on and off, and it takes a while to understand how to get that switch to work really well. So there's somebody today, it was Prescott actually mentioned homeostasis, right? Well, actually in neuroscience, we talk more and more about allostasis. It's a little bit more complicated than just this, actually. It looks more like this, all right? Balancing things is not easy and requires a lot of different things to happen at the same time. So we're still working with this, trying to figure it out, and it's not that easy. So this is what I mean by it's not what you like, but what you want that counts. And I even tell this to my students. When you have students that start university, especially in the first 2 years, and especially this generation of student that has a bit of a tendency to want things like easy, give them my degree, I'm paying you money for my degree, just give it to me. They don't want to fail exams. They sue universities that they're failed if they don't get degrees and stuff like that. I say, look, if you're here because you think you're going to like it, like the rest of life, actually, you will be cruelly disappointed. You do things in life not because you like them necessarily or all the time. It's because you want them. Now, I have to say that a lot of this modeling that Ken Berridge is working on is he has a human application, which is actually addictions. And what's really interesting is actually, if you look at that literature, his model works perfectly well. Because people that are addicted, they usually won't say that they actually like being on cocaine or morphine or whatever. But they want it, right? So those terms are not random terms here. Like Berridge used them for a very clear reason, is that you're actually really suggesting this idea that it's kind of a dialectical kind of relationship between those two systems, going back and forth and back and forth. Explains maybe that concept of addictive personality, whatever that means, sensation-seeking behavior, and all of those things. Just a cute little story to finish. I have 2 minutes. Are you hooked on stupidity or status or fun if you're a raven that pulls the tail of wolves? And I'm sorry because I really spend way too much time, actually half a day, looking for a video. And I know, in fact, I see it on my desktop, but for some reason, since I upgraded my operating system, I can't open it anymore. But we have a great video from the Canadian Centre for Wolf Research of a wolf that's having a nap. In fact, we have a few of them. We've seen this so many times. And the wolf is just sleeping a little bit. And then there's a raven that lands just behind the wolf and then approaches the wolf. Pull the tail and goes like this. And the wolf looks back. And sometimes, unfortunately, they die doing this. They get killed. And ravens have this weird relationship with wolves where they actually spend quite a bit of time with wolves. Usually one group of raven will be quite associated with time, over time, with a specific pack. Will follow them everywhere. They have kind of symbiotic, mutualistic kind of relationship. I won't get into that. But essentially, you're wondering, why would you do this? So one of the theories of, if you know you're going to die, and some of them have seen their friends getting killed by the wolves doing this. So are they teenagers just doing stupid things, not really thinking about the consequences? Or are they trying to impress potential mates? It's quite possible. Hey, look at me. I'm courageous. Look at that. I'm risking my life, you know. Or maybe it's a way of impressing for status other males, for instance, that maybe would be a little bit, you know, if they're competing for status. It's a way of saying, look, I mean business. I'm not afraid of being killed by a wolf. Look at what I'm going to do now. And the others go like, whoa, yeah, okay, this guy means business. He's crazy. Or maybe it's just fun. Like bungee jumping and all that kind of stuff. You know? Maybe it's just fun. Maybe you don't need to find a kind of evolutionary explanation for why they would actually do this. So I think maybe, hopefully, I don't know if it worked this time. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, and I changed this talk quite significantly for today. Maybe you see what we mean now by wanting something and not necessarily liking it, but also working with those two kind of systems. And hopefully you can see the potential relevance to training, especially if you use the tools that I know many of you use, like the clicker, for instance, and schedules of reinforcement or intermittent reinforcement. And you can probably see also the relevance to personality theory and working dogs, especially in terms of how you can actually maintain their desire to work and making sure that they actually have fun. That's it for me for now. Thank you.